One of the secrets to understanding Calouste Gulbenkian is to understand that he was a citizen of the world, and in particular, he was a citizen both of the East and of the West. And I think in the West, we often see the Western bit and we don't see the Eastern bit. But his family was from the Middle East. We've managed to trace back the Gulbenkian name to the 4th century AD, when the family was around Vaspurakan, which is just southwest of what's currently Armenia. And the family left that area about in the 11th century, went to Caesarea, and then left there in 1700 and went to Istanbul. So deeply imbued with that. His mother was Persian, a Persian Armenian, and he was brought up in the Ottoman Empire. He had an education there, understood that mentality, but then also, like quite a lot of rich Armenians at that time, was educated in the West. So he went to Marseille to learn French, and then went to King's College here in London, where he studied engineering and graduated with a first-class degree in engineering at the age of 19, which even in those days was extraordinary. He was about to become a scientist, and in fact Lord Kelvin, who's probably one of the most distinguished British scientists ever, was very interested in him and tried to persuade him to become a researcher. But his father, Calouste's father, Sarkis Gulbenkian, said, "You're not going to do that, you have to come into the family business." And his father was in kerosene importing, which was the early oil industry. And he insisted that Calouste learn about the business. And Calouste therefore went on a trip from the Black Sea all the way over to the Baku oil fields, which is where Sarkis Gulbenkian had some interests. And it was an extraordinary trip to do, because it is now, and it certainly was in those days, very wild country. And he did it in a way, not just bumming around. He actually read every single book that had been written on the area, as far as I can see, about the nature of the area, the ethnography of the area, the arts, the carpet weaving, and also about the oil industry as well. And at the end of that period, he wrote a book, which is this book here, La Transcaucasie et la Péninsule d'Abchéron, which recounts his observations about the countries he passed through, and also 4 or 5 chapters at the end about the Baku oil industry, which, reading it many years later, is amazingly insightful. As well as that book, he wrote two articles for the Revue des Deux Mondes, which caught the attention of the Minister of Oil in the Ottoman Empire, who then commissioned him to do a study of the prospects for oil in the Ottoman Empire. And he did that largely through secondary sources, but realized that there was a huge potential for oil in the Middle East in the Ottoman Empire, and published a paper which was very well received, which led to the Sultan getting very interested in this, and finally led to a concession for Calouste Gulbenkian. So there's that bit of it, which is the very Ottoman piece of him. But it was even broader than that, because he also had good connections with the Persian government through his mother. And not only was he an advisor to the Ottoman government, he was also for many years an economic advisor to the Persian government. And in fact, he was offered the concession for all of the Persian oil before he was offered the one for Ottoman oil. And he turned it down because he said it was too speculative, which was probably the biggest mistake of his entire life. But anyhow, in the Ottoman he was more successful. And at the time, and this is where the Western piece came in, he was an immigrant in the UK. And at that time, I suspect the UK was pretty racist. So he had all sorts of disadvantages, but he turned those disadvantages to his benefit. So at the time, the British and the Germans were trying to get concessions from the Ottoman government for oil exploration. And they were doing it in competition with each other, and they were doing it completely the wrong way. So they would go to the wrong people, and they would cause offence by seeking to bribe them in the wrong way. And Calouste said, don't do that, let me be your intermediary, and don't be in competition, let's do this all together. And he managed to bring those two groups together, and this is just before the First World War. And he got a concession from the Ottoman government, which was for this company, the Turkish Petroleum Company, to have the rights to all of the oil within the Ottoman Empire. And he was given 15% of it, and the rest was divided up between the British and the Germans. And he then reduced that 15% to 5% in order to enable other people to participate. Now, this was in 1914, which was just before the First World War. The amazing thing, it was pretty extraordinary to have got that concession. He then held on to it through 2 world wars, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and crucially, the emergence of oil as the critical fuel for the Western powers. Because before that, a lot of it was kerosene, it wasn't so important. But when Churchill decided to convert the British Navy from coal to oil, which was in the First World War, it suddenly became extraordinarily important. There were all sorts of battles that went on to maintain that throughout the years, because the Ottoman Empire disintegrated. He had to get it confirmed in 1925 by the new Iraqi government, and then he had to ensure that always the great powers were on the inside rather than on the outside. He had this vision that it was much more important that people did things together and not fighting, and it was one of the things that would avoid, battles and wars. He, therefore, when the Germans lost the First World War, he brought in the French to replace the Germans, and he was very much instrumental in bringing in the French to take the German share. And then later he realized that they could not keep the Americans out, and he brought in them through their vehicle, the Near East Development Corporation. And that was what led to the famous Red Line Agreement in 1928. And that was an enormously difficult set of discussions which went on for many, many months. And it was difficult for many reasons, because they were trying to weigh up the different interests of large nations. It was the United States, it was Britain, it was France, all trying to wrestle with who would get what shares. But also, amongst all of those, was this one individual person, Calouste Gulbenkian, holding his own with all of these nations. And it turned out at the end of the discussions that he was actually the one that held the trump cards, because he had an essential veto to all of this. And he wanted a couple of things. One, he wanted to make sure that he preserved his 5%. And his argument was, when all of you guys weren't interested in this, I put in money, I kept this company going from 1914 for the last 14 years, I deserve to maintain that interest. And I was also the one that actually put the whole thing together originally. And secondly, he was determined that he should be given his cash rather than oil. And the rest of the companies were very happy to be paid in oil. They were oil companies, they could sell it. He couldn't, and he didn't want to be left with large amounts of oil arriving in his front garden without knowing what to do with it. He wanted to be paid in cash. So there was the sale of oil agreement. And it was an enormously difficult set of discussions, but finally they were agreed. And there's a story that there was an impasse about exactly what was to be defined within the old Ottoman Empire. And this was crucial, because a part of that agreement was that all of the partners agreed to only look for concessions within that area, within the concession. So they couldn't go off and negotiate separate concessions with different nations within the area that was defined by this agreement. And it was therefore critical to define the boundaries of that. And no one could agree, and he finally, the story goes, grabbed a red pen, got a map, drew a red line around the area, which is why it's called the Red Line Agreement, and said, that is the boundaries of the old Ottoman Empire, and I should know. I was born in it, I grew up in it, and I served in it. That then became the Red Line Agreement.